What if I told you that the woman standing at that charity gala, smiling gracefully as donors applauded her foundation's work, had no idea she was married to a criminal? Sarah Mitchell thought she knew her billionaire husband, Marcus Sterling. She thought their foundation was changing children's lives. She thought their perfect marriage was built on love and shared values. She was wrong about everything. When Sarah discovered a suspicious $500,000 transfer late one night, she uncovered something far more sinister than simple embezzlement. Her husband wasn't just stealing from their charity. He was running a sophisticated criminal network that had stolen over $400 million from children's education funds across America. Senators, federal judges, and tech moguls were all part of his scheme. But here's what Marcus didn't know. The naive wife he thought he could control was actually a former investigative journalist with a Pulitzer nomination. And when Sarah decided to take him down, she was willing to risk everything, her marriage, her safety, even her life, to expose the truth. This is the story of how one woman's courage brought down a criminal empire and saved millions of dollars meant for children who desperately needed it. It's a story about betrayal, justice, and the price of doing what's right when the stakes couldn't be higher. The crystal ballroom of the Manhattan Grand Hotel sparkled like a constellation under the $1,000 chandeliers, each crystal catching and fracturing light into rainbow fragments that danced across the faces of New York's elite. Sarah Mitchell stood at the center of it all, her emerald silk dress flowing like liquid fire as she moved gracefully between clusters of donors who had paid $5,000 per plate to support her foundation. The Children's Future Initiative had raised over $12 million that evening alone, money that would supposedly build schools, fund educational programs, and transform lives in underserved communities across America. Another spectacular triumph. "Darling," Marcus Sterling whispered in her ear, his hand possessively resting on the small of her back as cameras flashed around them. His cologne was expensive and subtle, the kind that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and his tailored tuxedo fit him like a second skin. To the 300 guests surrounding them in the opulent ballroom, they were the absolute embodiment of the perfect power couple. Marcus, the tech billionaire who had revolutionized cloud computing and data storage, and Sarah, the former Pulitzer Prize-nominated investigative journalist who had traded her press badge for philanthropy after their fairy tale marriage 5 years ago. Sarah turned to smile at her husband, but something flickered in his steel-gray eyes that made her pause for just a moment. It was there for barely an instant, a coldness that didn't match his public warmth, like ice beneath a thin layer of spring water, before his practiced charm returned with the seamless precision of a well-rehearsed performance. "The Henderson family wants to double their contribution for next quarter," Marcus continued, nodding toward a distinguished couple near the silent auction table, where original Picasso sketches and week-long stays at Italian villas were generating fierce bidding wars. "I told them you would personally oversee the school construction project in Detroit. They were absolutely thrilled by your hands-on approach." "Of course," Sarah replied automatically, though she wondered when exactly he had made such significant commitments on her behalf. Lately, Marcus had been making more and more decisions about her foundation without consulting her first. When she had questioned him about it just last week, he had laughed in that charming way of his and reminded her that his business acumen and connections were the primary reasons they could afford to be so generous with their charitable giving. Senator Patricia Williams approached their small circle, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the late hour and the humid August evening. Her navy blue gown was elegant but understated, exactly what one would expect from a politician who had built her career on representing working families. "Sarah, dear, I simply cannot express how grateful the Senate Education Committee is for your foundation's incredible work. The preliminary reports from the schools you've funded show absolutely extraordinary results." "Thank you so much, Senator," Sarah said, her smile genuine and warm. "The children's improvement in reading scores has exceeded our most optimistic expectations by over 30%. It's incredibly rewarding to see tangible evidence that our programs are making a real difference in these communities." Marcus squeezed her waist gently, his fingers applying just enough pressure to remind her of his presence. "My wife has always possessed an extraordinary gift for identifying educational programs that actually work," he said smoothly, his voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention in any room. "That's precisely why I leave the Foundation's operations entirely in her remarkably capable hands." The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that Sarah almost believed it herself for a moment. But she knew the truth was far more complicated. Marcus reviewed every single expense report that crossed her desk, personally approved every contractor who worked on foundation projects, and had insisted on installing his own proprietary financial software across all foundation operations 6 months ago. For a man who claimed to leave things entirely in her hands, he certainly kept his fingers in every conceivable pie. "If you'll excuse us for just a moment," Marcus said to the senator with his most diplomatic smile, "I need to steal my beautiful wife away briefly. There are some very important donors from California who specifically requested to meet her, and I promised we'd make time for them before the evening concludes." As they walked across the polished marble floor, their footsteps echoing softly beneath the classical music being performed by the string quartet, Marcus leaned close again. His breath was warm against her ear, but his words carried an undertone that made her skin prickle with unease. "Remember what we discussed earlier about the Thompson Group situation?" he said quietly. "They're considering a very significant partnership with the foundation, potentially our largest corporate relationship to date, but they need absolute assurance that our organization maintains the highest possible standards of financial transparency and operational excellence." Sarah nodded, though unease crept up her spine like cold fingers. The Thompson Group was Marcus's latest acquisition target, a chain of educational technology companies that specialized in digital learning platforms for underserved communities. She couldn't shake the growing feeling that her foundation was somehow being used as a stepping stone for his business deals, though she had no concrete evidence to support her suspicions. The evening continued in a blur of carefully choreographed handshakes, posed photographs for society magazines, and polite conversations about tax benefits and charitable giving strategies. Sarah played her part perfectly, the devoted philanthropist wife who had dedicated her life to helping others. But her mind kept returning to Marcus's earlier comment about leaving the foundation operations in her hands. If that were actually true, why did she need his explicit approval for any expenses over $10,000? Why did all major contractor relationships require his personal sign-off? And why had he insisted on replacing her longtime financial advisor with someone from his own company? As the last guests departed near midnight, the ballroom slowly emptying as valets brought luxury vehicles to the hotel's circular drive, Sarah and Marcus rode home in contemplative silence in their black Tesla Model S. The leather seats were heated despite the warm summer night, and classical music played softly through the premium sound system. Their penthouse apartment overlooked Central Park from the 42nd floor, a spectacular view of the city that never truly slept, spread out below them like a glittering circuit board. Marcus immediately headed toward his private study upon their arrival, claiming he had urgent emails from his Hong Kong office that couldn't wait until morning. "You know how it is with international business, darling," he said, loosening his bow tie as he disappeared behind the heavy oak door. "The markets never sleep, and neither do our competitors." Sarah changed into comfortable silk pajamas and made herself a cup of chamomile tea, a nightly ritual that usually helped her decompress from the intensity of foundation events. She had learned over the years that Marcus often worked until 3 or 4 in the morning, disappearing into his study with its triple locked door, soundproof walls, and military-grade security system. He claimed the extreme security measures were absolutely necessary because of the sensitive business information he handled. But Sarah had always found it odd that he was more protective of his home office than some government facilities she had visited during her journalism career. Unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, she wandered into the spacious living room and opened her laptop computer. The Foundation's website displayed smiling faces of children in newly constructed schools, dedicated teachers working in modern classrooms equipped with the latest technology, and families whose lives had been genuinely transformed by educational opportunities that wouldn't have existed without their programs. This work mattered to her in a way that transcended her marriage to Marcus, in a way that connected to the deepest parts of her identity and purpose. She had grown up in the foster care system, bouncing between homes throughout her childhood, and education had been her salvation, her escape route to a better life and a meaningful career. A notification suddenly popped up on her laptop screen, the soft chime making her jump slightly in the quiet apartment. The Foundation's primary bank account showed a large transfer that had just been processed. $500,000 moved to an account she didn't recognize. The timestamp showed the transaction had occurred just 23 minutes ago, while Marcus was supposedly answering urgent emails from his international business partners. Sarah's hands began to tremble slightly as she clicked through the transaction details. Her journalism instincts immediately alert to something that didn't feel right. The receiving account belonged to something called Sterling Acquisitions LLC, a company name she had never heard mentioned before. More troubling still, the transfer had been authorized using her digital signature, though she had absolutely no memory of approving any such payment, especially not one of this magnitude. Her heart rate increasing, she quickly navigated to the Foundation's comprehensive financial dashboard, something she checked weekly but had never scrutinized with the detailed attention she now brought to bear. As she scrolled through months of transactions, patterns began to emerge that made her stomach clench with growing dread. Regular transfers to Sterling Acquisitions LLC, Urban Development Partners, Future Holdings Incorporated, and half a dozen other companies she had never approved payments to, all of them using her supposedly secure authorization codes. The chamomile tea grew cold on the side table as Sarah spent the next 2 hours diving deeper and deeper into the Foundation's financial records. Her investigative skills returning like muscle memory as she traced money flows and identified suspicious patterns. What she discovered made her question everything she thought she knew about her marriage, her foundation, and the man sleeping peacefully in the bedroom down the hall. Money specifically earmarked for school construction was being systematically diverted to shell companies that seemed to exist only on paper. Donations that generous families had made specifically for teacher training programs were flowing into accounts that appeared to have no legitimate educational purpose whatsoever. The $12 million raised that very evening would likely follow the same pattern, disappearing into Marcus's complex business empire while she unknowingly provided the perfect cover story for what was beginning to look like massive, systematic fraud. Sarah closed her laptop and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the glittering city spread below her like a vast electronic ocean. The lights of thousands of apartments and offices twinkled in the darkness, each one representing lives and dreams and hopes for the future. She had built her entire professional reputation on exposing corruption and protecting the vulnerable, on shining light into dark corners where powerful people thought they could hide their crimes. Now it appeared she had become an unwitting accomplice to exactly the type of fraud she had once fought against with every fiber of her being. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times, its deep bronze notes echoing through the silence. Marcus was still in his study, bright light visible under his locked door, probably moving more money around while she sat here grappling with the magnitude of what she had discovered. Sarah realized with crystal clarity that her seemingly perfect life was built on a foundation of lies and theft, and she was the only person positioned to expose the truth. But first, she needed irrefutable proof that would hold up in federal court, and she needed to be very, very careful about how she gathered that evidence, because the man she had married was clearly far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Sarah woke before dawn with a plan forming in her mind like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. Marcus was already gone from their bed, having left for what his carefully written note described as an early breakfast meeting with potential investors for his latest acquisition target. The note was written in his precise handwriting on expensive letterhead, the kind of casual luxury that had once seemed romantic, but now felt calculated and cold. She had exactly 3 hours before their housekeeper Maria arrived for her Tuesday cleaning schedule, and approximately 4 hours before Marcus typically returned for lunch when he was conducting local business. That gave her a narrow but potentially sufficient window to gather the evidence she needed without arousing suspicion. Sarah made strong coffee with steady hands, though her heart was racing like a marathon runner approaching the finish line. 20 years as an investigative journalist had taught her that the most damaging evidence was usually hidden in plain sight, protected only by the criminal's assumption that no one would think to look, or that they were too powerful to face consequences even if discovered. Marcus's private study remained locked as always, secured by both electronic and physical locks that would require professional tools to bypass. But Sarah knew every inch of their expansive apartment, including details Marcus had probably forgotten about. He kept backup files on an older laptop computer in their bedroom closet, hidden behind a row of expensive Italian suits he rarely wore. She had discovered the device several months ago while searching for her winter coat and had assumed it was simply an outdated computer he had forgotten to dispose of properly. The laptop powered up with a soft electronic hum, its fan whirring quietly in the morning silence. no password protection, Marcus's first critical mistake, and perhaps a sign of the arrogance that had allowed him to operate so boldly for so long. The desktop contained dozens of folders with cryptic names like Project Alpha, Urban Initiative Phase 2, Foundation Bridge Operations, and Strategic Partnership Development. Sarah's hands trembled as she clicked on the folder labeled Foundation Bridge Operations, somehow knowing that whatever she found inside would change her life forever. What she discovered made her physically nauseous, her stomach churning as if she had just witnessed a violent crime. Detailed spreadsheets showed exactly how money from her children's future initiative was being systematically diverted through a complex network of shell companies to fund Marcus's business acquisitions. The Thompson Group deal she had heard about the previous night was being financed partly through foundation funds, disguised as payments to legitimate educational contractors who either didn't exist or were providing vastly inflated invoices for minimal services. But the scope of the operation went far beyond simple embezzlement or even sophisticated theft. Marcus had created an entire parallel financial system designed to wash charitable foundation money through multiple layers of seemingly legitimate companies before it ultimately landed in his business ventures and investment accounts. The children's faces from their foundation website flashed through her mind. Kids in Detroit and Chicago and Philadelphia who believed their lives were being changed by educational programs that existed only as elaborate fictions designed to justify massive financial transfers. Sarah inserted a USB drive with trembling fingers and began systematically copying files, her journalism training guiding her to organize the evidence methodically. 23 gigabytes of financial records, email correspondence detailing the coordination of fraudulent transactions, and what appeared to be detailed instruction manuals for other wealthy individuals on how to use charitable foundations for tax evasion and sophisticated money laundering operations. Marcus wasn't just stealing from her foundation, he was running a criminal consulting service, teaching other members of the elite how to exploit the charitable sector for personal gain. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. Breakfast meeting running longer than expected. We'll be home around 4 instead of noon. Love you more than you know. Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, analyzing every word for hidden meaning. How easily the lies rolled off his fingers. Even in something as mundane as a text about being late for lunch, the man she had married, the man she had shared her bed and her dreams with for 5 years, seemed to be a complete fabrication, a carefully constructed persona designed to provide cover for criminal activities. She continued copying files with methodical precision, organizing them by date, amount, and criminal activity. The pattern that emerged painted a clear picture of escalating fraud over the past 3 years, starting small with a few $1,000s diverted here and there to companies that performed legitimate services at somewhat inflated prices, but gradually expanding as Marcus's confidence and business empire grew. The most recent files revealed his next major target, a massive urban redevelopment project in Chicago that would displace hundreds of low-income families to make room for luxury condominiums and upscale retail developments. The project was being funded through 6 different charitable foundations, including Sarah's, with the money disguised as urban education initiatives and community development programs. The families who would be pushed out of their neighborhoods had no idea that charitable donations meant to help their children were actually financing their displacement. Sarah's investigative instincts kicked into high gear as she realized the full scope of what she had uncovered. This wasn't just about her marriage or even her foundation's reputation. Marcus was orchestrating financial fraud on a scale that could affect thousands of vulnerable families across multiple cities. The children who should be receiving educational support were instead subsidizing gentrification projects that would destroy their communities and scatter their families to the economic margins. She photographed key documents with her phone, uploaded critical files to multiple cloud storage accounts under fake names, and made 4 separate backup copies on different USB drives. One went into her gym bag, one into her purse, one into the false bottom of her jewelry box that Marcus didn't know about, and one into a safety deposit box key that she had kept secret since her journalism days when protecting sources sometimes required extreme operational security. By noon, Sarah had compiled enough evidence to bring down not only Marcus, but potentially the entire network of wealthy individuals participating in his foundation fraud scheme. Names she recognized from charity galas and political fundraisers filled the client lists: senators, federal judges, tech executives, real estate moguls, and entertainment industry figures were all using charitable foundations to launder money, evade taxes, and fund business deals that would have been impossible through legitimate financing channels. The apartment suddenly felt like a beautifully appointed prison, every expensive piece of furniture and artwork now revealed as potential evidence of crimes against some of the most vulnerable people in American society. Every luxury item Marcus had showered her with over the years, every romantic gesture and thoughtful gift, was now tainted by the knowledge that it had been paid for, with money stolen from children who needed schools, families who needed housing assistance, and communities that deserved so much better than they were receiving. Sarah's phone rang, the sudden sound making her jump so violently that she nearly dropped the laptop. The caller ID showed Detective Rachel Torres, an old friend from her journalism days who now worked financial crimes for the NYPD and had occasionally served as a source for stories about white-collar criminal investigations. "Rachel," Sarah answered, fighting to keep her voice steady and normal. "Sarah, perfect timing. I was just thinking about you while reviewing a case. I'm working on a complex investigation involving foundation fraud and money laundering, and I remember that brilliant investigative series you wrote about charity scams back in 2018. Do you have a few minutes to chat about red flags and warning signs that donors should watch for?" The irony was so perfect and terrible that Sarah almost laughed out loud. Here was her oldest friend in law enforcement, calling to ask for advice about exactly the type of crime her husband had been committing on a massive scale for years. "Actually, Rachel," Sarah said carefully, "I think I might have some information that could help your case in ways you're not expecting. Can we meet somewhere completely private where we won't be overheard or observed?" "Of course. How about Joe's Coffee on 72nd Street in about an hour?" "You sound stressed. Sarah, is everything okay with you and Marcus?" Sarah looked around the apartment that had been her home for 5 years, knowing with absolute certainty that she might never feel safe here again. The man she had trusted with her heart, her future, and her life's work had betrayed not just her, but thousands of children and families who depended on charitable programs for hope and opportunity. "I think I'm about to blow up my entire life, Rachel, but it's definitely the right thing to do. Those are usually the decisions that are most worth making," Rachel said with the wisdom of someone who had spent years watching people make difficult moral choices. "I'll see you in an hour." And Sarah, "Whatever this is about, you don't have to handle it alone." Sarah packed a small overnight bag with hands that were steadier than she had expected, including copies of the most critical evidence and enough clothes for several days. She had no idea where she would stay or what would happen when Marcus eventually discovered what she had found. But she knew with absolute certainty that she couldn't spend another night under the same roof as a man who was systematically stealing from children. She left a carefully worded note for Marcus on the kitchen counter. "Gone to visit my college roommate Jennifer in Boston for a few days. Need some time to think about us and our future. We'll talk when I get back." It wasn't entirely a lie. She did need time to think. Though Boston wasn't her actual destination, the woman who had once exposed a corrupt governor's abuse of emergency hurricane relief funds was about to take on an even more personal fight for justice, and this time the stakes couldn't possibly be higher. As Sarah walked toward the elevator, she felt lighter than she had in months. Despite the overwhelming weight of evidence in her bag and the devastating knowledge of her husband's true nature, for the first time since her wedding day 5 years ago, she was being completely honest with herself about who Marcus Sterling really was and what she was prepared to do about it. The elevator doors closed behind her with a soft whisper, and Sarah descended from the 42nd floor toward a future she couldn't predict, but finally truly controlled. Somewhere in the city below, children were attending schools that would never be built. Families were applying for assistance that would never come, and communities were hoping for help that was being stolen before it could reach them. But not for much longer. Sarah Mitchell was back on the story, and this time it was personal. Joe's Coffee on 72nd Street buzzed with the usual afternoon energy of a Manhattan neighborhood institution. Students hunched over laptops with enormous textbooks spread across small tables, freelancers conducting animated phone conversations, and neighborhood regulars reading newspapers while nursing oversized mugs of coffee that had long since grown cold. Sarah had arrived 25 minutes early, choosing a corner table where she could watch the entrance while keeping her back to the wall. Old habits from her journalism days when meeting sources sometimes required careful attention to personal security. Detective Rachel Torres spotted her immediately upon entering, navigating through the crowded cafe with the confident stride of someone accustomed to reading rooms for potential threats and maintaining situational awareness even in casual settings. At 38, Rachel had the lean, athletic build of a dedicated runner and dark eyes that seemed to catalog and analyze everything they encountered. Her black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore a navy blazer that Sarah knew concealed the service weapon that was as much a part of Rachel's daily routine as her morning coffee. "You look like you haven't slept in about 3 days," Rachel said without preamble, sliding into the chair across from Sarah with the easy familiarity of a friendship that had survived career changes, romantic relationships, and the general chaos of adult life in New York City. "That's because I haven't," Sarah replied, wrapping her hands around her cooling latte like it was an anchor to the normal world she was about to leave behind. "Rachel, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound absolutely insane, but I need you to hear me out completely before you say anything or ask any questions." Rachel's expression shifted seamlessly from casual concern to professional alertness, the transformation immediate and complete. "I'm listening, and I'm not recording anything. Whatever you need to tell me, this is just two friends having coffee." Sarah took a deep breath and began with the previous night's discovery of the unauthorized transfer, speaking quietly but clearly as she laid out the evidence methodically. She had practiced this conversation during the subway ride, organizing the information in a way that would be easy for Rachel to follow and difficult to dismiss as paranoia or misunderstanding. Rachel didn't interrupt, but Sarah could see her friend's training taking over as she processed the information, asking silent questions and filing details for later analysis. "So let me make sure I understand this correctly," Rachel said when Sarah finished her initial summary. "Your husband has been systematically using your charitable foundation as a front to launder money for his business acquisitions, and he's also running what amounts to a criminal consulting service for other wealthy individuals who want to do the same thing." "And that's exactly what I'm saying, and I have digital evidence to prove every word of it." Rachel leaned back in her chair, her coffee forgotten as she absorbed the implications. "Sarah, do you understand what you're describing here? This isn't just embezzlement or simple fraud. This is organized financial crime involving political figures, federal tax evasion, wire fraud across state lines, and potentially money laundering for other criminal organizations. We're talking about federal charges that could put people away for decades." "I know," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was discussing. "I spent 20 years investigating stories like this. Rachel, the difference is that, this time, I'm married to the primary suspect." "Where's the evidence?" Sarah reached into her purse and handed Rachel a USB drive, the small device containing enough information to potentially bring down dozens of powerful individuals and recover hundreds of millions of dollars stolen from charitable organizations. "Financial records going back 3 years, email correspondence detailing the coordination of fraudulent transactions, client lists with some very familiar names, and what appears to be a detailed instruction manual for setting up fraudulent charitable foundations." Rachel pocketed the drive without looking at it, her expression growing more serious by the moment. "Sarah, I need to ask this as your friend and as a police officer. Are you absolutely certain about these accusations? Because once we open this investigation, there's no going back. Your marriage will be over. Your life will be turned completely upside down. And if Marcus is as well connected as you're suggesting, you could be in real physical danger." Sarah had been asking herself the same question since dawn, and the answer had only become clearer with each passing hour. "Rachel, there are children in Detroit who think they're getting a new school library, but their money is actually funding luxury condominiums in Miami. There are families in Chicago who donated their grocery money to help build playgrounds, and those funds are sitting in accounts controlled by real estate speculators who are planning to demolish their neighborhood. I can't live with that knowledge and do nothing about it. What about Marcus? Any idea how he might react when he realizes what you've discovered?" Sarah's stomach tightened as she considered the question that had been haunting her all morning. "I honestly don't know anymore. The man I thought I married would never have been capable of any of this. The man who actually did this is capable of absolutely anything, and I have no idea what his limits might be." Rachel checked her watch, then pulled out her phone to send a quick text message. "I need to get this evidence to my lieutenant immediately, but I want you somewhere safe first. Do you have family you can stay with? Somewhere Marcus wouldn't think to look for you. I grew up in foster care. Remember, Marcus is the closest thing I have to family, which is probably why I missed the warning signs for so long. I was so grateful to finally have someone who seemed to care about me that I didn't ask enough questions about where his money was really coming from. Then you're staying with me and Tony until we figure this out, Rachel said firmly, referring to her husband of 12 years. My apartment has better security than most police stations, and Tony's a former Marine who won't mind having a house guest for a few days. The relief Sarah felt was immediate and overwhelming, like stepping out of a freezing wind into a warm room. She had been so focused on gathering evidence and planning her escape that she hadn't fully considered her own safety or where she would go once she left the apartment. Thank you. I honestly don't know what I would have done otherwise. You would have figured something out because that's who you are, Rachel said with conviction. But you don't have to do this alone. I'm going to make some calls and get our white-collar crime unit involved immediately. We'll need to move fast before Marcus realizes what's happening and starts destroying evidence or liquidating assets. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Sarah's phone buzzed with another text message from Marcus. Lunch meeting was incredibly productive. Thompson Group is very interested in partnering with your foundation for their Chicago project. We should celebrate tonight. Made reservations at 11 Madison Park for 7 o'clock. Can't wait to share the good news. Sarah showed the message to Rachel, who frowned as she read it. He's already planning to use foundation money for the Chicago deal. We need to move faster than I thought. There's something else, Sarah said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Last night at the gala, Marcus seemed different somehow, more confident, almost arrogant, like he was enjoying some private joke that no one else understood. And some of the other foundation executives were acting strangely too, like they were all part of some secret club. Criminals often get overconfident when they think they're untouchable, Rachel replied. It's usually right before they make their biggest mistakes and leave the evidence that brings them down. They left the coffee shop together, walking toward Rachel's unmarked police car parked 2 blocks away on Amsterdam Avenue. Sarah felt exposed on the street, imagining Marcus's business associates or private security personnel watching her movements from the windows of expensive cars or office buildings. She had never thought of herself as particularly paranoid, but living with a criminal for 5 years had apparently taught her to expect surveillance and deception as normal parts of daily life. Rachel, Sarah said as they reached the car, I need to ask you something, and I want a completely honest answer. Shoot, what are the realistic chances that Marcus actually goes to prison for this? Not just gets arrested and makes bail, but actually serves serious time. Rachel was quiet for a moment as she started the engine, checking her mirrors carefully before pulling into traffic. With the evidence you've described, if even half of it holds up in federal court, he's looking at 15 to 25 years minimum. The federal charges alone will bury him. And if we can prove he was running a criminal enterprise, we're talking about RICO charges that could put him away for life. Sarah felt a complex mix of relief and profound sadness washing over her. The man she had fallen in love with 5 years ago was either completely fictional or had been systematically destroyed by greed and the corruption that came with unchecked power. Either way, that person was gone forever, and it was time to mourn him properly while focusing on protecting his victims. One more question, Sarah said. How long do I have before my life becomes a complete media circus? Rachel pulled into traffic, checking her mirrors carefully for any signs they were being followed. Once we arrest Marcus, and this hits the news about 6 hours before every reporter in the city is camped outside, wherever you're staying, your foundation will be frozen pending investigation, your personal assets will be under federal scrutiny, and you'll probably be fielding interview requests from every major network and news organization in the country. Sarah nodded, having expected as much from her own experience covering similar stories. Then I guess I better prepare mentally for the worst media storm of my entire life. Actually, Rachel said with a slight smile as they drove through Central Park, you might want to prepare for something completely different. Like what? Like the possibility that you're about to become a genuine hero. The woman who brought down a major financial fraud ring and saved millions of dollars meant for children's education. That's exactly the kind of story people love to hear, especially when the whistleblower is someone who sacrificed her own comfortable life to do the right thing. Sarah looked out the window at the city she had called home for 2 decades, watching joggers and cyclists enjoying the late afternoon sunshine in the park. Somewhere in those towering buildings were children who would have better schools because of what she was about to do. Families who would keep their homes because fraudulent development deals would be stopped, and communities that would finally receive the help they had been promised by people they had trusted. For the first time since discovering Marcus's crimes, Sarah felt something other than betrayal and fear coursing through her veins. She felt the familiar electricity of purpose, the same feeling that had driven her best investigative work over the years. Rachel Torres's apartment in Brooklyn Heights offered a spectacular view of the Manhattan skyline, the lights of the city twinkling like earthbound stars across the East River. But Sarah found herself staring at her phone instead of the scenery. 3 missed calls from Marcus in the past hour, each followed by increasingly concerned text messages asking about her sudden trip to Boston and whether she was feeling well. "You're going to have to answer him eventually," Rachel said, settling down on the couch with a steaming mug of tea. Her husband, Tony, had tactfully disappeared into his home office after being briefly introduced, understanding without explanation that police business was about to invade their living room and that some conversations required privacy. "I know," Sarah replied, her stomach churning with anxiety. "I just need to figure out exactly what to say. If I act too distant or upset, he'll know something is seriously wrong. If I act too normal, I might accidentally say something that tips him off to what I've discovered." Rachel's laptop chimed with an incoming video call notification. "That'll be Lieutenant Morrison from Financial Crimes. Are you ready for this conversation?" Sarah nodded, though her mouth felt as dry as cotton. She was about to officially become a police informant against her own husband, crossing a line that would make their marriage's destruction not just inevitable, but legally documented. Lieutenant Morrison appeared on the screen, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone who had seen every conceivable type of financial fraud over a 25-year career. Her office background showed commendations and certificates, along with photographs of what appeared to be successful prosecutions of white-collar criminals. "Ms. Mitchell, Detective Torres has briefed me on your situation. First, I want to commend you for coming forward with this information. That took genuine courage, and I want you to know that we take cases like this very seriously." "Thank you, Lieutenant," Sarah said, though she didn't feel particularly courageous at the moment. "I've had our technology team do a preliminary analysis of the files you provided," Morrison continued, her expression growing more serious. "What we're looking at here is significantly larger than individual foundation fraud. Your husband appears to be running a sophisticated money laundering operation that involves at least 12 major charitable organizations and over $200 million in misdirected funds over the past 3 years. The number hit Sarah like a physical blow, the magnitude of the theft almost incomprehensible. $200 million stolen from charities meant to help children, families, and communities in desperate need of assistance. "Lieutenant, how do we stop this before more money disappears?" "Very carefully," Morrison replied. "We're dealing with extremely powerful people who have the financial resources to disappear evidence, intimidate witnesses, and potentially flee the country if they suspect we're closing in. We need to build an absolutely airtight case before we make any arrests, because we're only going to get one chance to bring down the entire network." Rachel leaned forward toward the laptop camera. "What's our realistic timeline here?" "Ideally, we'd like 6 months to trace all the money flows and identify every participant in the criminal network," Morrison said. "But given that Mr. Sterling is actively planning new fraudulent transactions, including this Thompson Group deal, we probably have maybe 2 weeks before we'll be forced to move." Sarah's phone buzzed in her hand with another call from Marcus. She looked at the screen, then at Lieutenant Morrison. "Should I answer this?" Morrison nodded decisively. "Keep it brief and as normal as possible. You're visiting a friend in Boston. You miss him. You'll be home soon. Don't give him any reason to suspect that anything has changed in your relationship." Sarah answered the call, putting it on speaker so the others could hear both sides of the conversation. "Hi, honey. Sorry I missed your calls earlier. I was at lunch with Jennifer and forgot to check my phone." "I was starting to get worried," Marcus said, his voice carrying that familiar note of concern that now sounded calculating and manipulative to Sarah's ears. "You left so suddenly this morning, and your note was pretty vague about why you needed to get away." "I know, and I'm sorry about that. I just needed some time to think and decompress. Last night's gala was wonderful, but sometimes I feel overwhelmed by all the attention and the pressure to be on all the time. Of course, darling. Take all the time you need. I've rescheduled our dinner reservation for tomorrow night instead. The Thompson Group meeting went even better than expected. They're very excited about partnering with your foundation on several major projects. Sarah forced enthusiasm into her voice while her stomach turned. That's wonderful news. I can't wait to hear more about the details. I love you, Sarah. Come home soon. I love you too, she replied, the lie tasting bitter and wrong in her mouth. After hanging up, Morrison spoke first. He's definitely moving forward with the Thompson Group deal, which means he's planning to divert more foundation funds within the next few days. We need to significantly accelerate our timeline. What does that mean exactly? Sarah asked. It means we're going to wire you for sound and put you back in your apartment, Rachel said grimly. We need recordings of Marcus discussing the fraud directly, in his own words. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as the implications hit her. You want me to go back there and pretend everything is normal while wearing a recording device? Morrison's expression was sympathetic but absolutely firm. Ms. Mitchell, without direct evidence of your husband acknowledging the fraud in his own words, we have a financial crime that could take years to prosecute successfully through the courts. Defense attorneys will claim the transactions were legitimate business expenses, that signatures were forged, that computer systems were hacked. With recordings of him discussing the details of the criminal scheme, we can arrest him and freeze all assets within 48 hours. What if he discovers the wire? What if he figures out what I'm doing? Rachel reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand reassuringly. We'll have surveillance teams positioned around your building and a backup plan to extract you immediately if anything goes wrong. You won't be alone in there. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city where she had built her career and her life, knowing that everything familiar was about to disappear forever. The comfortable apartment, the foundation work she loved, the social circle she had cultivated, all of it would be replaced by surveillance teams, court appearances, witness protection protocols, and the constant fear that Marcus's powerful associates might decide she knew too much. There's something else we need to discuss, Morrison said, her tone becoming even more serious. Your foundation will almost certainly be shut down during the investigation, and even if you're cleared of any wrongdoing, it will take months or possibly years to restore public trust. Are you prepared for that reality? The Children's Future Initiative had been Sarah's proudest achievement, her way of giving back to communities like the ones where she had grown up in the foster care system. The thought of losing it felt like losing a child. If shutting down my foundation is the price of stopping $200 million in theft from other children's charities, then yes, I'm prepared for that sacrifice. Morrison smiled for the first time during the video call. Detective Torres, I think we definitely have the right person for this operation. Sarah turned back from the window, her decision made. When do we start tomorrow morning? Morrison replied. We'll fit you with the wire at 9 a.m., brief you thoroughly on what we need you to accomplish, and have you back in your apartment by noon. Your husband expects you home tomorrow evening, which gives us a perfect timeline to work with. After the call ended, Sarah and Rachel sat in contemplative silence for several minutes. The television played softly in the background, showing the evening news with no mention of foundation fraud or money laundering schemes. By this time next week, Sarah realized, this story would likely be dominating every news cycle in the country. Are you scared? Rachel asked quietly. Terrified, Sarah admitted without hesitation, but also angrier than I've ever been in my life. Do you know what $200 million could have built? How many schools, how many educational programs, how many lives could have been completely transformed? That's exactly why you're doing this, Rachel said. Not for revenge against Marcus, but for justice for everyone he's stolen from. Sarah's phone buzzed with another text from Marcus. Spoke with the contractor about the Chicago project this afternoon. Everything is moving forward beautifully. You've built something truly wonderful. Darling. She showed the message to Rachel, who shook her head in disgust. He's not just stealing money. He's using your reputation and your genuine desire to help people as cover for his crimes. That makes it deeply personal. It was already personal, Sarah replied, her voice hardening with resolve. Tomorrow, it becomes justice. That night, Sarah lay awake in Rachel's guest room, staring at the ceiling and trying to prepare mentally for what might be her final conversation with the man she had once planned to spend the rest of her life with. By this time tomorrow evening, she would either have the evidence needed to bring down a massive criminal conspiracy, or she would be running for her life from people with unlimited resources and no moral constraints. Either way, the woman who had once trusted Marcus Sterling with her heart, her future, and her foundation would cease to exist. In her place would be someone harder, wiser, and absolutely committed to protecting others from the kind of betrayal she had experienced. Sarah finally fell asleep just before dawn, dreaming of children in newly constructed schools built with money that had actually reached its intended destination, and of communities that would finally receive the help they had been promised by people they thought they could trust. The FBI field office in Lower Manhattan hummed with quiet intensity at 8 in the morning, the kind of focused energy that Sarah remembered from newsrooms during major breaking stories. She sat in a beige conference room that smelled of coffee and industrial carpet, watching technicians test sophisticated recording equipment while Agent Jennifer Kim explained the operation's details with the precision of someone who had conducted dozens of similar undercover operations. Rachel stood nearby against the wall, her usual calm demeanor betraying subtle signs of worry for her friend's safety. She had insisted on being present for the briefing, using her credentials as the detective who had initiated the investigation to maintain oversight of Sarah's involvement. "The wire is completely undetectable by standard security sweeps," Agent Kim said, holding up a device smaller than a shirt button. "It will record everything within a 30-foot radius and transmit directly to our surveillance van parked outside your building. The audio quality is crystal clear, and we'll be monitoring every word in real time." Sarah nodded, though her mouth felt as dry as sandpaper. "How long does the battery last?" 14 hours, which is more than enough for what we need to accomplish. Remember, you're not trying to entrap your husband or trick him into saying things he wouldn't normally say. We just need him to acknowledge activities we can already prove through documentation. But having his own words will make prosecution much more straightforward. Lieutenant Morrison entered the room carrying fresh coffee and what appeared to be a detailed script of conversation topics. "We've identified the key subjects you need to steer the conversation toward: the Thompson Group deal, the Chicago redevelopment project, and most importantly, we need him to mention other participants in the criminal network by name." Sarah reviewed the list of individuals they hoped Marcus would reference during their conversation: senators, federal judges, tech executives, real estate developers, people she had shaken hands with at charity galas and dinner parties, never imagining they were partners in a criminal enterprise that was stealing from some of the most vulnerable people in American society. "What if he doesn't want to talk about business?" Sarah asked. "Marcus has been compartmentalizing more lately, keeping foundation work separate from our personal conversations. He might just want to have a romantic dinner and avoid discussing anything related to work." "Then you make him talk about it," Rachel said firmly. "You're an investigative journalist, Sarah. You know how to ask questions that get people talking, how to show interest in their work until they can't help but share details." Agent Kim carefully attached the wire to Sarah's clothing, positioning it where it would pick up conversation most clearly while remaining completely invisible. "Remember, we'll be monitoring everything in real time from the surveillance van. If you feel unsafe at any point, just say the word Boston in any context and we'll extract you immediately." Sarah practiced using the safety word, trying to make it sound natural in various conversational contexts. The backup plan involved a fake emergency phone call that would require her to leave the apartment immediately, giving her cover to escape if Marcus became suspicious or threatening. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," Morrison said, her expression becoming more serious. "We've discovered that Marcus has been in contact with some questionable private security contractors in the past week. We're not entirely sure why, but it suggests he might be feeling pressure from somewhere, possibly investors getting impatient or law enforcement in another jurisdiction asking questions." The news sent a chill down Sarah's spine like ice water in her veins. What kind of pressure are we talking about? Maybe investors demanding faster returns on their money? Maybe federal investigators in other cities starting to ask questions about similar schemes? The point is, he might be more volatile than usual today, more prone to anger or suspicious behavior. Rachel checked her service weapon and adjusted her jacket to ensure easy access. "I'll be in the surveillance van with Agent Kim, and we'll have backup units stationed within 2 blocks of your building. Nothing is going to happen to you, Sarah." Sarah appreciated the reassurance, though they all knew that if Marcus discovered what she was doing, the several minutes it would take for backup to reach her 42nd floor apartment could be more than enough time for a desperate man to do irreparable damage. At 11:30, Sarah took a taxi from the FBI office to her apartment building, watching the city scroll past the window like scenes from someone else's life. The doorman greeted her normally, commenting that he had missed seeing her the previous day and asking about her trip to Boston. Everything appeared routine and familiar, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into an elaborate trap where she was both the hunter and the prey. The penthouse felt different somehow, though nothing had changed physically since she had left the previous morning. Maybe it was knowing the truth about Marcus's criminal activities, or maybe it was the weight of the recording equipment hidden in her clothing. But the space that had once felt like home now felt like a stage set for a performance that could determine the rest of her life. Marcus arrived at exactly 1 o'clock, carrying an expensive bouquet of white roses and wearing the charming smile that had first attracted her 5 years ago. He kissed her cheek with what seemed like genuine affection and immediately began talking enthusiastically about how much he had missed her during her brief absence. "I was thinking we could spend the afternoon together before dinner," he said, setting the flowers in a crystal vase. "Maybe take a walk through Central Park. You always said that's where you feel most relaxed and can think most clearly." Sarah forced herself to smile naturally while alarm bells rang in her head. A public park would make it impossible to record any meaningful conversation, and she suspected Marcus knew exactly what he was suggesting. "Actually, I was hoping we could stay in and catch up. I want to hear more about this Thompson Group partnership. It sounds like an amazing opportunity for the Foundation's future growth." Marcus's expression flickered for just a moment before returning to its usual warmth, but Sarah caught the brief flash of calculation in his eyes. "Of course, darling. You know how much I love discussing your work and all the good we're doing together." They settled in the spacious living room with expensive wine and imported cheese, Sarah positioning herself where the wire would pick up conversation most clearly while maintaining the casual intimacy of a married couple reconnecting after time apart. "The Thompson Group seems very focused on urban development projects," she said, sipping her wine and maintaining eye contact. "How exactly does that align with our educational mission? I want to make sure I understand the connection before we commit to anything." "Well," Marcus said, settling back in his leather chair with obvious comfort, "they understand that quality education requires quality communities. The Chicago project will create housing and commercial spaces that naturally support families with school-age children. It's a holistic approach to community development." It was a perfectly crafted non-answer, the kind of corporate speak Marcus used when he wanted to sound helpful and knowledgeable without revealing anything substantive. Sarah pressed deeper with the skill of someone who had spent years interviewing evasive politicians and corrupt business executives. "I was reviewing our recent expenditures yesterday, and I noticed some payments to companies I didn't recognize. Sterling Acquisitions, Urban Development Partners, Future Holdings. Are these Thompson Group subsidiaries, or do they serve some other function in our operations?" Marcus's wine glass paused halfway to his lips, and Sarah could see him processing the question carefully. "Darling, why are you suddenly asking about specific vendors and contractors? You've never shown interest in those operational details before." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but kept her voice casual and curious. "Jennifer mentioned that her foundation had some issues with shell companies being used to inflate invoices and skim money. I just want to make sure we're not vulnerable to that kind of fraud. You've always been so good at protecting us from those risks." "Jennifer has always been somewhat paranoid about business relationships," Marcus said dismissively. "Our financial controls are much more sophisticated than most foundations. I've built systems that prevent exactly the kind of problems she's worried about." "Of course you have," Sarah agreed, letting admiration creep into her voice. "You've built such an incredibly efficient system for managing multiple funding, streams, and partnerships. Sometimes I wonder how you manage to coordinate so many different financial relationships and keep everything running so smoothly." Marcus smiled, and for a moment Sarah saw a flash of genuine pride in his accomplishments, the kind of ego that had probably made him vulnerable to taking increasingly larger risks. "It's all about understanding how money flows in the modern economy. Darling, the key is having the right relationships with the right people in regulatory positions. When everyone benefits from a transaction, compliance issues become much more flexible and manageable." Sarah's heart raced as she realized Marcus was essentially admitting to bribing government officials for regulatory flexibility. Exactly the kind of statement that would be devastating in federal court. She pressed forward carefully. knowing that pushing too hard could make him suspicious. That's absolutely brilliant strategy. I imagine some of our donor friends have learned similar approaches to maximizing their charitable impact while maintaining business flexibility. Oh, absolutely, Marcus said, warming to the topic and clearly enjoying the opportunity to discuss his criminal accomplishments with someone he thought he could trust. Patricia Williams has been particularly creative with her family foundation's investment strategies, and Judge Harrison's approach to charitable trusts is downright artistic in its sophistication. Sarah nodded enthusiastically while internally celebrating the fact that Marcus had just named a United States senator and a federal judge as participants in the criminal network, exactly what the FBI needed to expand their investigation and bring down the entire conspiracy. I'd love to learn more about these innovative approaches, she said. Maybe we could have dinner with some of these friends soon. I feel like I could learn so much from their experience. Marcus's expression grew suddenly serious, his relaxed demeanor shifting to something more guarded and calculating. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice water, every nerve in her body suddenly alert to danger. Of course, Marcus. What is it? Why are you suddenly so interested in the business side of the foundation? In 5 years of marriage, you've never asked detailed questions about financial operations or shown curiosity about our contractor relationships? The question hung in the air like a blade poised to fall, and Sarah could feel the wire recording every word while knowing that her response might determine whether she walked out of the apartment that evening or whether the FBI would be investigating her disappearance by morning. Sarah stared at Marcus across the living room, his question echoing in the sudden silence like a gunshot. The weight of the wire against her skin felt enormous, as if it were broadcasting her deception to the entire world. Her hands remained steady around her wineglass, but her mind raced through possible responses while Marcus watched her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. I suppose I'm finally growing up and taking more responsibility, she said with a laugh that sounded forced even to her own ears. You've always encouraged me to take more interest in how we achieve our mission, not just what we achieve. I guess I'm finally listening to your advice. Marcus studied her face with the patience of a predator who had cornered his prey and had all the time in the world to decide what to do next. Yes, he said slowly. I have said that many times over the years. Sarah's phone chimed with a text message, the sound cutting through the tension like a fire alarm. She glanced at the screen and felt her world tilt sideways as terror flooded her system. The message was from Rachel, but it wasn't the casual check-in they had planned. Instead, it read, Marcus knows about the wire. Get out now. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she processed the implications. Their carefully planned operation had been compromised somehow, and she was alone in the apartment with a man who now knew she was recording their conversation for federal investigators. Bad news, darling, Marcus asked, his voice carrying a note she had never heard before, something cold and calculating that made every instinct scream danger. Just Jennifer confirming dinner plans for next week, Sarah replied automatically, setting her phone aside while her mind frantically searched for escape strategies. The bathroom window led to a fire escape, but it was a 42-floor drop to the street. The front door was closer, but Marcus stood between her and freedom, and she had no idea what he was capable of when cornered. Marcus rose from his chair with fluid grace, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered the spectacular view of Central Park that had once seemed so romantic. You know, Sarah, I've been thinking a lot about trust in marriage lately, how absolutely essential it is for spouses to be completely honest with each other about everything. Sarah fought to keep her voice steady while adrenaline flooded her system. I couldn't agree more. Marcus. For instance, Marcus continued, still facing the window with his back to her, if one spouse discovered something disturbing about the other's business practices, the loving thing to do would be to discuss it openly rather than involving outside authorities who might not understand the full context. The words hit Sarah like physical blows, confirming her worst fears. He definitely knew about her investigation, but the question was how much he knew and whether the FBI surveillance team had been compromised as well. Marcus, I'm not sure what you're suggesting here. He turned from the window slowly, and Sarah found herself looking at a man she had never met before. Gone was any pretense of charm or warmth. His eyes held the flat coldness of someone who had killed before and would do it again without hesitation. I'm suggesting that my wife has been asking very specific questions about financial operations. Immediately after taking a mysterious trip to Boston that we both know never actually involved visiting Boston, Marcus said, walking slowly toward her, like a cat approaching a wounded bird. I'm suggesting that someone has been copying files from my private computers and sharing them with people who have no business seeing them. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might burst. I don't know what you're talking about. Marcus. Detective Rachel Torres. NYPD Financial Crimes Division. Ring any bells? Darling. The game was completely over. Marcus knew everything, which meant the FBI surveillance team was either compromised or walking into a trap, and Sarah was trapped alone with a man who had just revealed himself to be far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Marcus, let me explain what happened. No need for explanations, he interrupted smoothly, reaching into his jacket pocket. Sarah braced herself for a weapon, but instead he pulled out a small electronic device that looked like a sophisticated scanner. This little gadget detects recording equipment and wireless transmissions. It's been beeping softly since you sat down 20 minutes ago. Sarah's mind raced through her options while Marcus held up the device like evidence in a courtroom. The FBI safety word was Boston, but if Marcus already knew about the surveillance operation, using it might trigger something worse than just capture. You're wearing a wire, aren't you, Sarah? Marcus asked conversationally, as if discussing the weather. Recording our private conversation in hopes of getting me to admit to crimes that exist only in the imagination of overzealous investigators. The money laundering isn't imaginary, Sarah said, abandoning any pretense of innocence. The stolen foundation funds aren't imaginary. The children who aren't getting schools because you're building luxury condominiums instead, they're not imaginary either. Marcus laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor or warmth. My idealistic wife, always worried about other people's children. Do you know what your fundamental problem is? Sarah, you never understood that the world runs on power and money, not good intentions and moral principles. And you never understood that some things matter more than power and money. Like what? Love, justice, family, loyalty, please. You married me because I could give you the resources to play at being a philanthropist and feel important. I built your foundation. I managed your finances. I made you relevant in social circles that would never have noticed a former journalist from foster care. The words were designed to wound deeply, and they succeeded in hitting their target. But they also ignited something fierce and unbreakable in Sarah's chest. Not just anger, but absolute clarity about who Marcus really was and what he was capable of doing to protect his criminal empire. You're right about one thing, she said, standing to face him directly despite the fear coursing through her veins. I did marry you because I thought you could help me make a real difference in the world. I was wrong about your character, but I wasn't wrong about wanting to help children who grew up like I did. How incredibly touching, Marcus replied sarcastically. Unfortunately, your newfound moral clarity is going to be very expensive for both of us, and for some other people you probably care about. Sarah heard something in his tone that made her skin crawl with dread. What do you mean by that? I mean that some very powerful people have invested significant amounts of money in maintaining our current financial arrangement. People who don't appreciate federal investigators asking uncomfortable questions about their charitable foundations and business practices. Marcus, what have you done? Before he could answer, Sarah's phone buzzed with another text message. This one was from an unknown number. Your FBI friends are currently indisposed. You're completely on your own now. Marcus glanced at the message and smiled with satisfaction. Actually, that's not entirely accurate. You're not completely on your own. You still have me. Sarah felt the walls of the apartment closing in around her like a collapsing building. The FBI surveillance team was compromised. Rachel was possibly in danger or worse, and she was trapped 42 floors above the city with a man who had just revealed himself to be part of something much larger and more dangerous than simple foundation fraud. What do you want from me? She asked. It's quite simple. Really. You're going to call Detective Torres and tell her that you made a terrible mistake, that you misunderstood some financial documents and jumped to completely wrong conclusions about my business practices. You're going to withdraw your cooperation with the investigation and make this entire problem disappear permanently. And if I refuse, Marcus walked to his desk and opened a laptop computer, turning the screen so Sarah could see what was displayed. Surveillance photos of Rachel entering her apartment building that morning, time-stamped and clearly taken by professional photographers with high-end equipment. Your friend is an excellent detective, but she's not nearly as careful about her own personal security as she should be, Marcus said calmly. It would be truly unfortunate if something happened to her because of your inability to mind your own business and trust your husband. Sarah stared at the photos, understanding with crystal clarity that Marcus was threatening to hurt or kill Rachel if she didn't cooperate with covering up his crimes. The man she had married, the man she had shared a bed with for 5 years, was calmly discussing violence against her best friend as if it were a routine business transaction. You're absolutely insane if you think threatening Rachel will make me back down from this. I'm not threatening anyone, Marcus said with chilling calm. I'm simply offering you a choice with clear consequences. Cooperate fully, and everyone you care about stays safe and healthy. Continue this investigation, and I can't guarantee anyone's well-being, including your own. Sarah looked around the apartment that had been her home for 5 years, seeing it now for what it truly was, a beautiful cage built by a predator who had been planning this exact conversation for much longer than she had realized. How long have you known about my investigation? She asked. Since the moment you accessed my backup files yesterday morning. My computer systems are more sophisticated than you realized. About your fundamental character flaws. Since our second date, when I realized you were predictably moral in ways that would make you useful for some purposes and dangerous for others. The casual cruelty in his voice was somehow worse than outright anger or passion. Marcus wasn't acting out of desperation or fear. This was calculated, planned, and executed with the cold efficiency of someone who had done this before. Sarah's phone rang, Rachel's name flashing on the caller ID like a lifeline to the world outside this nightmare. Answer it, Marcus said calmly. Tell her you're safe and that you've changed your mind about the investigation. Make it convincing. Sarah, because her life depends on how well you can lie. Sarah looked at the phone, then at Marcus, then at the surveillance photos of Rachel on his laptop screen. In that moment, she understood that whatever choice she made would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone she cared about and every child whose educational funding had been stolen. The phone continued ringing as Sarah realized that the real test of her character wasn't what she had discovered about Marcus. It was what she was willing to risk to stop him and save the people who trusted her. Sarah stared at her ringing phone, Rachel's name flashing insistently on the screen, while Marcus watched her with the patient intensity of a spider who had spent years carefully weaving his web. The surveillance photos of Rachel remained open on his laptop, a silent threat that spoke louder than any words he could have chosen. Answer it, Marcus repeated, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had grown accustomed to being obeyed without question. Sarah answered the call but kept her eyes locked on Marcus's face, searching for any sign of weakness or uncertainty. Rachel, Sarah, thank God you answered. We lost contact with your wire about 15 minutes ago, and our surveillance team reported unusual activity around your building. Are you safe? I'm fine, Sarah said carefully, her mind racing through possibilities while Marcus nodded approvingly. The FBI surveillance team was indisposed according to the anonymous text, but Rachel was clearly still operational and unaware of the full scope of the danger. That meant Marcus's reach had limits, or he was lying about the extent of his resources to intimidate her. We need to extract you immediately, Rachel continued, her voice sharp with urgency. Something's gone wrong with the operation, and I'm not taking any chances with your safety. I'm coming up to get you right now. No, Sarah said quickly, her pulse spiking with fear for her friend's safety. Don't come up here, Rachel. Marcus smiled approvingly, assuming she was protecting Rachel from immediate danger. But Sarah had a different calculation in mind. If Rachel was still free and operational, that meant the investigation wasn't completely compromised. Sarah just needed to buy time and find a way to signal the true nature of her situation without triggering Marcus's threats. Sarah, what's going on up there? Rachel's voice carried the sharpness of a detective who sensed deception and danger. I need more time to think about this entire situation, Sarah said, choosing her words with extreme care. The evidence is more complicated than we initially realized. There might be innocent explanations for some of the financial irregularities we discovered. Marcus nodded encouragingly, but Sarah continued talking, layering additional meaning into her words that she hoped Rachel would understand based on their years of friendship and professional collaboration. The Thompson Group situation is particularly complex and delicate. There are very powerful people involved who might retaliate violently against anyone who asks too many questions. People with unlimited financial resources who could hurt police officers and their families without hesitation. On the other end of the line, Rachel went completely silent. Sarah could almost hear her friend's experienced mind processing the subtext, that Sarah was in immediate physical danger and that specific threats had been made against law enforcement personnel and their loved ones. "I understand completely," Rachel said finally, her voice carefully controlled. "Why don't you come down to the lobby where we can discuss this more privately and safely?" "I can't leave the apartment right now," Sarah replied, glancing at Marcus, who was listening to every word. "But I'll call you later tonight when I've had more time to think through all the implications and consequences." "Sarah, I have to go now." "Rachel, please take care of yourself and be extremely careful. Watch your back." Sarah ended the call and looked at Marcus, who was studying her with renewed interest and what appeared to be grudging respect. "That was very well done," he said approvingly. "Though I suspect your detective friend is considerably smarter than you're giving her credit for. Rachel knows when to back down from a fight she can't win." "We'll see about that," Marcus replied, closing the laptop with deliberate precision. "In the meantime, we need to discuss your immediate future and what happens next." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the apartment's air conditioning system. "What do you mean?" "I mean that while you've agreed to cooperate with ending this investigation, I can't simply trust your word and send you back into the world. Too much money is at stake. Too many important people are depending on this situation being resolved permanently and completely." The word permanently hung in the air like a death sentence, and Sarah realized with growing horror that Marcus had never intended to let her leave the apartment alive, regardless of whether she cooperated with his demands or not. She was a liability that knew too much and needed to be eliminated, not a wife whose loyalty could be purchased with threats. "Marcus, I'm your wife. I would never do anything to hurt you or damage what we've built together." "No, Sarah. You're a former investigative journalist with direct evidence of a $200 million fraud network and personal knowledge of criminal conspiracy involving federal judges, senators, and other powerful government officials. What you are is a problem that requires a permanent solution." Sarah backed slowly toward the kitchen, her mind cataloging potential weapons and escape routes while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. The front door was still blocked by Marcus's position, but the apartment had emergency stairs accessible through the service entrance near the pantry, if she could reach them without being stopped. "Where are you going, darling?" Marcus asked, following her movement with his eyes while remaining perfectly relaxed in his chair. "I need some water. This conversation is making me lightheaded and nauseous." "Of course it is. Learning that your entire marriage was built on carefully constructed lies can be quite overwhelming and disorienting." Sarah reached the kitchen and opened a cabinet, ostensibly looking for a glass but actually palming a chef's knife with an 8-inch blade. The weight of it in her hand provided a small measure of comfort and confidence. "How long were you planning this?" she asked, keeping her voice conversational while positioning herself where she could either defend herself or make a desperate run for the service door. "Planning what specifically? The foundation fraud operation that's been developing for years as opportunities presented themselves. Meeting and marrying you. That was more opportunistic than planned. When I realized you had both the reputation and the naivety to provide perfect cover for the operation, marriage seemed like the most efficient long-term solution." The casual admission that their entire relationship had been a calculated deception felt like a physical blow to her chest, but Sarah forced herself to focus on immediate survival rather than emotional devastation. "And now that the operation is exposed, now you know too much to live with peacefully and too little to die quietly," Marcus said, standing up and moving closer to her position. "But I want you to know that I'm not a monster. Sarah, I'll make it quick and relatively painless." As he spoke, Marcus pulled a small pistol from inside his jacket, the weapon appearing in his hand with practiced ease. The sight of the gun transformed Sarah's fear into razor-sharp clarity and survival instinct. She was no longer the betrayed wife seeking justice. She was a woman fighting for her life against a predator who had gravely underestimated her determination to survive. "Before you kill me," Sarah said, gripping the knife handle tighter while keeping it hidden behind the kitchen island, "I want to know one thing. Did you ever feel anything real for me? Or was it all just part of the elaborate con? Marcus paused, apparently considering the question with genuine seriousness. You know, there were actually moments when I almost forgot you were just a means to an end. You have a genuinely good heart, Sarah, and remarkable integrity. In a different life, under different circumstances, that might have been enough. But not in this life. Not in this life, and not with this much money at stake. Marcus raised the pistol with steady hands, and Sarah made her move. Years of self-defense classes and martial arts training kicked in as she dove sideways toward the service door, using the solid kitchen island as cover while the gun fired. The bullet shattered a ceramic vase where her head had been just moments before, sending fragments of pottery flying across the marble floor. Sarah burst through the service door into the building's utility corridor, her bare feet silent on the cold concrete floor. Behind her, she could hear Marcus cursing fluently and pursuing her, his dress shoes echoing loudly in the enclosed space. The emergency stairs were 50 feet away. If she could reach them before he got a clear shot, she might have a fighting chance. Another gunshot echoed through the narrow corridor, the bullet sparking off metal pipes near her head and filling the air with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Sarah reached the stairwell and began descending as fast as her legs would carry her, taking steps 3 at a time while praying she wouldn't slip and break her neck on the concrete stairs. 42 floors stretched below her like a concrete canyon, and Marcus was somewhere above, armed and increasingly desperate. Sarah's phone had no signal in the emergency stairwell, cutting off her connection to help and leaving her completely isolated. She was alone in a concrete tower with a killer, racing toward an uncertain freedom that seemed impossibly far away. But as Sarah ran for her life down the endless stairs, one thought burned clear and bright in her mind. She was no longer just trying to expose Marcus's crimes or save her own life. She was fighting to survive long enough to ensure that justice reached all of his victims, and that the children whose futures had been stolen would finally receive the help they deserved. The hunt had begun in earnest, and Sarah Mitchell absolutely refused to be anyone's prey. Sarah's lungs burned like fire as she reached the 20th floor, her bare feet slapping against the cold concrete steps with a rhythm that echoed through the emergency stairwell like gunshots. The sound made it impossible to tell if Marcus was still pursuing her down the stairs or if he had found another way to get ahead of her position. She paused on the landing, pressing her back against the painted cinder block wall while she listened intently for footsteps above her. Nothing but silence, which was somehow more terrifying than the sound of pursuit would have been. The quiet suggested that Marcus had stopped chasing her down the stairs and was implementing a different strategy. Her phone showed 1 bar of signal strength. She quickly typed a text message to Rachel. In emergency stairwell, Marcus has gun, armed and dangerous. Get help to building immediately. Sar? The message failed to send twice before finally going through on the 3rd attempt. Sarah continued downward, moving more carefully now to minimize noise. At the 15th floor, she heard the distinctive ping of an elevator arriving somewhere beyond the stairwell walls. Marcus had stopped chasing her down the stairs and was using the elevator system to get ahead of her, positioning himself to intercept her when she reached the ground floor. She needed an alternative way out of the building. Sarah opened the heavy door to the 15th floor and found herself in a hallway identical to the one outside her apartment. Luxury condominiums lined both sides of the carpeted corridor, their doors sealed and anonymous. At the far end, a sign indicated emergency exits and service elevators. Moving quickly down the carpeted hallway, Sarah found the service elevator and pressed the call button with trembling fingers. These elevators were designed for maintenance workers and furniture deliveries. They had stops at the parking garage and loading dock that Marcus might not think to monitor if he was focused on the main lobby. The elevator arrived with a soft chime that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Sarah stepped inside and selected the parking garage level, 3 floors below ground. As the doors closed, she caught a glimpse of the floor indicator above the main elevator bank, showing that Marcus was on the 7th floor and descending rapidly toward the lobby. The parking garage was dimly lit and filled with luxury vehicles belonging to the building's wealthy residents. Sarah made her way between rows of BMWs and Mercedes, looking for an exit that wouldn't require her to pass through the main lobby where Marcus was likely waiting. Her bare feet were silent on the smooth concrete, but every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Near the back of the garage, she found a ramp that led to the building's loading dock. The heavy security door was propped open, probably by a delivery driver making multiple trips from his truck. Sarah slipped through the gap and found herself on street level behind the building, facing a narrow alley that connected to Amsterdam Avenue. Freedom was 50 yards away, but as Sarah ran toward the mouth of the alley, a black sedan pulled up directly in front of her path. The rear window rolled down smoothly, revealing Marcus sitting calmly in the back seat with that same patient smile. "Get in the car, Sarah." She turned to run back into the alley, but two men in dark suits had appeared behind her, blocking her retreat. Professional security contractors, the unsavory characters, Lieutenant Morrison had mentioned during their briefing. "Sarah, you're making this much more difficult than it needs to be," Marcus said, stepping out of the sedan with fluid grace. "I had hoped we could handle this privately and discreetly, but you've forced me to involve people who are far less sentimental about loose ends." One of the contractors moved closer, his hand resting inside his jacket where Sarah could see the outline of a shoulder holster. "Ma'am, please come with us voluntarily. It makes everything easier for everyone involved." Sarah looked around desperately for escape routes or witnesses. The street was busy with afternoon pedestrians and traffic, but no one was paying attention to what appeared to be a routine pickup by a luxury car service. She could scream for help, but these men were clearly professionals who had handled similar situations before. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, trying to buy time while scanning for opportunities. "Somewhere we can have a private conversation without interruptions or eavesdropping," Marcus replied smoothly. "The outcome of that conversation depends entirely on your willingness to be reasonable about this situation." Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Rachel. Marcus held out his hand expectantly. "Give me the phone." "Sarah." She looked at the device in her hand, knowing it was her last connection to the outside world and any hope of rescue. Then she looked at Marcus, seeing not the charming husband she had married but the cold criminal who had orchestrated a massive fraud network. "No," she said simply. The contractor stepped forward aggressively, but Marcus waved him back with a subtle gesture. "She'll cooperate once she understands the full situation." "Won't you, darling?" Sarah answered the phone while maintaining eye contact with Marcus, her voice clear and steady. "Rachel." "Sarah, where are you? We have units surrounding your building, but the doorman says you never came through the main lobby." "I'm on Amsterdam Avenue behind the building," Sarah said clearly, speaking loud enough for nearby pedestrians to hear. "Marcus is here with two armed men. They're trying to force me into a black sedan." The contractor reached for the phone, but Sarah stepped backward into the busy street. Car horns blared as vehicles swerved around her, but the chaos bought her precious seconds of time and attention. "License plate number." Rachel's voice was sharp and completely professional. Sarah read off the sedan's plates while the contractor pursued her into traffic, drawing angry shouts from drivers. "Rachel, Marcus admitted to everything. The fraud network includes Senator Williams and Judge Harrison. He's been planning to kill me from the beginning." A delivery truck blocked her view of Marcus and his men for a crucial moment. When it passed, Sarah saw them retreating hastily toward the sedan as the sound of police sirens grew louder from multiple directions. "Sarah, get to a public place with lots of witnesses," Rachel ordered through the phone. "Stay on the line and keep moving." Sarah ran toward the subway entrance at 72nd Street, her bare feet now cut and bleeding from the rough pavement. Behind her, the black sedan's engine roared to life, but the approaching sirens seemed to be discouraging immediate pursuit. She reached the subway entrance as the first police cars arrived on Amsterdam Avenue, their red and blue lights painting the afternoon shadows in alternating colors of emergency response. Sarah collapsed onto a bench in the underground station, her whole body shaking violently with adrenaline and delayed terror. "I'm in the subway," she told Rachel breathlessly. "I think I'm safe for the moment." "We're coming to get you right now." "Sarah, you did incredibly well under impossible circumstances. The recording from your wire captured everything before the signal was cut, and we have enough evidence to arrest Marcus and start dismantling the entire criminal network." Sarah closed her eyes, letting relief wash over her like warm water. The nightmare wasn't over. Marcus was still free somewhere in the city, and his associates remained dangerous. But the truth was finally in the hands of people who could act on it decisively. "Rachel," Sarah said, her voice hoarse from running and fear, "I need you to know that if something happens to me, the real victims here are the children whose educational funding was stolen. Whatever it takes to get that money back to where it belongs. That's what matters most. Nothing's going to happen to you, Rachel replied with absolute conviction. But yes, we're going to recover every stolen dollar and return it to the communities that deserve it. When Sarah waited for rescue in the underground station, commuters flowed around her in the normal rhythm of city life. None of them knew that a major criminal conspiracy was unraveling above their heads, or that the barefoot woman sitting on the bench had just risked everything to expose a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government and business. But they would know soon enough. By tomorrow morning, Marcus Sterling's name would be synonymous with betrayal and fraud, and Sarah Mitchell would be recognized as the woman who brought down a criminal empire built on stolen charity funds meant for children. The hunt was finally over. Justice was just beginning. The FBI field office buzzed with controlled chaos at 11 o'clock that night. Fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across walls, now covered with charts mapping the extensive financial fraud network. Photographs of suspects, and detailed timelines showing years of systematic theft from charitable foundations across the country. Sarah sat in the same conference room where she had been fitted with the wire 15 hours earlier. But everything else had changed dramatically in ways she was still struggling to process. Agent Kim set down a fresh cup of coffee and reviewed the evening's rapid developments with the efficiency of someone accustomed to complex investigations that moved at breakneck speed. We've made 17 arrests in the past 8 hours, including Senator Patricia Williams, Judge Harrison, and 4 other federal officials. Marcus Sterling remains at large, but we've frozen all assets connected to him personally and issued federal warrants for his arrest. Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic mug, still processing the sheer scope of what they had uncovered through her investigation. How much money are we talking about in total? Conservative estimate based on what we've traced so far, $420 million stolen from charitable organizations over the past 5 years, Lieutenant Morrison said, joining them at the conference table with a thick stack of financial documents. Your foundation was actually one of the smaller operations in the network. Some of these criminals were running multiple fake charities simultaneously while serving in government positions. Rachel Torres entered the room carrying laptop computers and what appeared to be evidence boxes. Sarah, I need you to look at these financial records and tell me if you recognize any of the transaction patterns or company names. Sarah reviewed the papers with her journalism training, helping her identify suspicious patterns in the complex data. This payment to Educational Futures LLC, that's the contractor Marcus said was building the Detroit School Library. But according to these bank records, the money went to purchase luxury condominiums in Miami Beach. That's exactly the kind of testimony we need for prosecution, Agent Kim said, making notes. You had direct conversations with Marcus about these specific projects, so you can establish his intent to defraud and his knowledge that the money was being diverted. The conference room door opened suddenly, and a young FBI analyst hurried in with an urgent laptop displaying real-time tracking information. We've got a break on Sterling's location. His credit card was used 37 minutes ago at a private airfield in Westchester County. Morrison was on her feet immediately, reaching for her radio. How long to scramble our helicopter? Already in the air, ma'am, the analyst replied efficiently. But there's something else you need to know. The airfield manager reports that Sterling boarded a private aircraft with 4 other individuals, including someone matching the description of his associate Sophia Lee. Sarah felt a jolt of recognition at the familiar name. I remember Sophia from several foundation events over the years. She always seemed overly interested in our financial operations and donor relationships, but I thought she was just being supportive of our mission. Turns out she was recruiting new participants for the criminal network, Rachel said grimly. We found encrypted communications between her and at least 8 other foundation executives who were convinced to participate in similar fraud schemes. The scope of the conspiracy continued to expand with each new piece of evidence they uncovered. What had started as Sarah's discovery of irregularities in her own foundation had revealed a nationwide network of charity fraud involving dozens of prominent individuals and hundreds of millions in stolen funds that should have been helping vulnerable communities. Agent Kim's radio crackled with an urgent transmission from the helicopter unit. This is Air Unit 7. Target aircraft is on final approach to runway 27, requesting permission to intercept. Negative, Morrison responded immediately. Do not engage the aircraft. Observe and report only. Sarah looked up from the financial documents she was reviewing. Why aren't you stopping them from leaving? Because we want to know exactly where they're going and who they're planning to meet, Morrison explained with the strategic thinking of someone who had spent years building complex cases. Marcus Sterling is a middle manager in this operation, not the mastermind. If we arrest him now, we might never identify the people at the very top of the criminal pyramid. The radio crackled again with another update. Air Unit 7 reporting, target aircraft has landed and is currently taxiing to a private hangar. Multiple vehicles are approaching the aircraft from different directions. Sarah found herself in the strange position of hoping her husband would escape temporarily if it meant exposing the full extent of the criminal network and recovering money for all the victims. The children whose educational funds had been stolen deserved justice against everyone involved, not just the few individuals they had managed to arrest so far. Agent Kim, Sarah said, looking up from the evidence. I want to help with this investigation in whatever way I can, for as long as it takes. I know these people personally. I've attended their social events, and I might be able to identify connections that aren't obvious from financial records alone. Actually, we were hoping you'd say exactly that, Morrison replied with what might have been a smile. We're going to need someone who can speak credibly about Foundation operations when this goes to trial. Would you be willing to serve as a cooperating witness for the prosecution? Sarah didn't hesitate for even a moment. Absolutely. Whatever it takes. The radio transmission resumed with new information. Air Unit 7 reporting aircraft departure. Flight plan filed indicates destination is Georgetown, Cayman Islands. Morrison's expression showed grim satisfaction. Perfect. Now we get to see which offshore banks and hidden accounts they're trying to access. Every transaction they make from this point forward gives us more evidence and potentially more suspects. As the night wore on and dawn approached, Sarah found herself at the center of a federal investigation that was expanding far beyond anything she had imagined when she first discovered those suspicious transfers. The betrayal by Marcus had been devastating on a personal level, but the opportunity to help recover hundreds of millions of dollars for legitimate charities felt like a purpose worthy of the pain she had endured. Rachel sat down beside her longtime friend as the investigation continued around them. How are you holding up through all of this? Better than I expected. Honestly, Sarah replied with genuine surprise. I keep thinking about all the schools that will actually get built now, all the children who will receive the educational help they were promised. It makes everything else feel manageable somehow. What will you do after this investigation is concluded? Sarah looked around the conference room at the evidence of corruption and criminal conspiracy, then at the dedicated law enforcement officers working tirelessly to restore justice and accountability. I think I'm going back to journalism full-time. There are clearly more stories that need to be told about protecting charitable giving. Agent Kim overheard the conversation and smiled approvingly. We could use more reporters who understand how financial crimes actually work in practice. Most journalists get lost in the technical details and miss the human impact. Then it's settled, Sarah said with growing conviction. I'll help you finish this investigation completely. Testify at whatever trials are necessary, and then start writing about how to protect charitable organizations from this kind of systematic exploitation. The radio crackled one more time with a transmission that made everyone in the room stop their conversations and listen intently. Air Unit 7 reporting, target aircraft has been denied landing clearance in the Cayman Islands due to outstanding federal warrants. They're now requesting emergency landing permission at Nassau International Airport in the Bahamas. Sorghum, Morrison grinned with genuine satisfaction. Even better for our purposes. The Bahamas has a much stronger extradition treaty with the United States than the Caymans. Marcus Sterling just flew himself directly into federal custody. Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions washing over her. Relief that Marcus would finally face justice for his crimes. Sadness for the complete end of what she had once thought was a loving marriage. And deep satisfaction that the children whose futures had been stolen would finally receive the help they truly deserved. The criminal network was crumbling rapidly, and justice was finally within reach for everyone who had been victimized by the systematic theft of charitable funds meant for the most vulnerable members of society. 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell stood outside the Federal District Courthouse in Lower Manhattan, squinting in the bright April sunlight as reporters pressed forward with microphones, cameras, and urgent questions. The final trial in what the media had dubbed the Foundation conspiracy had just concluded with guilty verdicts for all remaining defendants, including Marcus Sterling, who had been extradited from the Bahamas to face comprehensive federal charges. Ms. Mitchell, how do you feel about your ex-husband's sentence? Called out a reporter from CNN, her voice cutting through the crowd noise. Sarah took a deep breath, choosing her words with the care of someone who had spent months learning to navigate intense media scrutiny. Marcus Sterling has been my ex-husband for 4 months now, since our divorce was finalized in December. As for his sentence, 30 years in federal prison without possibility of parole seems entirely appropriate for someone who systematically stole $420 million from charitable organizations designed to help children and families in desperate need. The sentence had been longer than even the most aggressive prosecutors had requested, but Marcus's complete refusal to cooperate with the ongoing investigation, his attempt to flee the country, and the judge's obvious disgust at the scope of the crimes had resulted in what legal experts were calling one of the harshest white-collar sentences in federal court history. "What will happen to all the stolen money?" asked another reporter from the Washington Post. Rachel Torres. Now Lieutenant Torres, following her promotion after successfully leading the investigation, stepped forward to field that question. "Recovery efforts have been extraordinarily successful beyond our initial expectations. We've traced and frozen approximately 94% of the stolen funds through international cooperation. That money is currently being returned to legitimate charitable organizations and the communities that were supposed to benefit from it originally." Sarah smiled genuinely as she thought about the schools that were finally under construction, the educational programs that were being restored with proper funding, and the families who were receiving the assistance they had been promised years earlier. The Detroit school library that Marcus had promised but never intended to build was now nearing completion, funded by recovered money from his Miami Beach real estate purchases. "Ms. Mitchell, will you be restarting your Children's Future Initiative?" asked a reporter from the New York Times. "The Children's Future Initiative will remain permanently closed," Sarah replied firmly. "But I'm working closely with several existing organizations to help them strengthen their financial oversight and fraud prevention measures. I'm also returning to investigative journalism full-time to write about these issues and help protect charitable giving." In her new book, Betrayed Trust: How to Protect Your Charitable Donations from Sophisticated Fraud, was already generating significant interest from publishers and had received advanced praise from financial crime experts. Sarah had also signed a contract with the Washington Post to write a monthly column about nonprofit accountability, financial transparency, and protecting vulnerable communities from exploitation. Agent Kim emerged from the courthouse and joined the group on the steps. "I can confirm that this investigation has led to significant reforms in how charitable foundations are monitored and regulated at the federal level. The Sterling case has become a textbook example for law enforcement agencies on how to investigate and prosecute complex financial crimes across multiple jurisdictions." The legislative reforms were already having measurable impact across the charitable sector. New federal requirements for foundation transparency and independent auditing had made it much harder for criminals to use charitable organizations as fronts for money laundering and tax evasion. Sarah had testified before Congress on 4 separate occasions, helping lawmakers understand exactly how the fraud had been perpetrated and what specific safeguards were needed to prevent similar schemes. "What's next for you personally, Ms. Mitchell?" asked a reporter from NBC News. Sarah looked up at the imposing courthouse where justice had finally been served, then back at the crowd of reporters and cameras documenting this conclusion to a story that had consumed her life for months. "I'm going to keep telling stories about the critical importance of protecting charitable giving and ensuring that donations reach the people they're intended to help. This case showed that when good people work together and refuse to be intimidated, even the most sophisticated criminal networks can be brought down completely." As the press conference concluded and the media attention began to dissipate, Sarah walked away from the courthouse with Rachel at her side. The legal proceedings would fade into history, the trials would become case studies in law schools, and life would gradually return to something resembling normal routine. But the lessons learned from Marcus Sterling's betrayal would shape the rest of Sarah's career and her understanding of how to protect vulnerable communities from exploitation. "Any regrets about how everything played out?" Rachel asked as they walked toward the subway station. "About exposing Marcus and his criminal network?" "None whatsoever," Sarah replied immediately without hesitation. "About marrying him in the first place? That's more complicated. I learned things about myself and about trust that I probably needed to learn. even if the process was incredibly painful. Such as what specifically? Sarah thought for a moment as they descended into the subway station. I learned that my instincts about people are actually better than I give them credit for. I had serious doubts about Marcus for months before I found the concrete evidence, but I talked myself out of investigating because I was afraid of what I might discover. Now I know that when something feels fundamentally wrong, it usually is wrong. They boarded the train that would carry them back to Brooklyn, leaving behind the federal courthouse and the circus of media attention. Sarah had testified in 9 different trials, helped recover hundreds of millions of dollars, and watched more than 40 criminals receive substantial prison sentences. The work had been emotionally exhausting, but it had also been deeply satisfying in ways she was still discovering. What about trust in relationships? Rachel asked. After everything Marcus put you through, are you worried about being able to trust people again in the future? Sarah smiled as the train pulled away from the courthouse stop. Actually, this whole experience reminded me that most people are fundamentally decent and trustworthy. You risked your career to help me. The FBI agents worked around the clock to build an airtight case, and prosecutors fought tirelessly to make sure every stolen dollar was returned to its rightful purpose. For every Marcus Sterling in the world, there are dozens of people committed to doing the right thing, even when it's difficult. As they rode through the tunnel beneath Manhattan, Sarah felt a profound sense of closure that had been building for months. The woman who had discovered those suspicious financial transfers in her apartment 8 months ago had been naive about her husband's true character, but absolutely correct about her own moral compass. The woman riding the subway today was wiser, stronger, and more committed than ever to protecting vulnerable people from those who would exploit their trust. The train emerged into brilliant sunlight as it crossed the Manhattan Bridge, and Sarah looked out at the sprawling city where she had built her career, suffered her greatest personal betrayal, and ultimately found her true purpose as a journalist and advocate. Somewhere in that vast urban landscape, other fraudsters were undoubtedly planning new schemes to exploit charitable giving and steal from those in need. But now there were people watching, investigating, and ready to expose corruption wherever it tried to hide. Sarah leaned back in her seat as the train carried her toward home and her new life as a journalist dedicated to protecting charitable giving from exploitation. She had lost a husband and a foundation, but she had gained something infinitely more valuable, the absolute knowledge that when faced with a choice between comfortable lies and difficult truths, she would always choose truth without hesitation. Marcus Sterling would spend the next 3 decades in federal prison, but the children whose educational funding he had stolen were growing up in schools built with recovered money. Senator Williams had lost her seat and her freedom, but communities she had betrayed were receiving the federal assistance they had been promised. Judge Harrison would never again have the power to corrupt the legal system, but trust in judicial integrity was being slowly rebuilt through reform and accountability. Sarah Mitchell had learned the hardest way possible that trust must be earned and constantly verified. But she had also learned that justice, though sometimes delayed, was always worth fighting for regardless of personal cost. The criminal network had crumbled completely. The stolen money was flowing back to communities that needed it most, and the reforms implemented because of her courage would protect future generations from similar exploitation. In the end, that was the only victory that truly mattered, ensuring that charitable giving would continue to reach the people who needed it most, protected by stronger safeguards and watched over by people who understood that some things are worth any sacrifice to preserve. The train carried Sarah toward her future as the city sprawled endlessly around them, full of stories waiting to be told and communities waiting to be protected. She was ready for whatever came next. Sarah's story reminds us that corruption can hide behind the most respectable facades, but courage and determination can expose even the most powerful criminals. If this story moved you, hit that like button to help others discover it. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between loyalty and justice? Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things to protect others. Your support helps us continue bringing you these incredible true stories of courage and justice. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people who never intended to become heroes.